In addition to our muscles being different sizes and having different strength, our muscle fibers can actually also be different types. And we classify muscle fibers based off of the speed of contraction, as well as what sort of metabolic pathway is used for ATP synthesis. So we classify fibers as either being slow or fast, and this is determined by the speed at which the myosin ATPases split ATP. So what's meant by that is remember that the head groups are going to break down ATP in order to power the cross-bridge cycling. And different types of myosin ATPases are going to break down that ATP at different rates. There's also a difference between the pattern of electrical activity between different types of motor neurons that affects the speed at which the muscle fibers respond and contract. We also classify based off of the metabolic pathway used for ATP synthesis, and we classify that as either oxidative or glycolytic. Oxidative fibers use aerobic pathways, and glycolytic fibers are going to use anaerobic pathways in order to produce ATP. These different types of muscle fibers are going to be better or worse at doing different kinds of jobs. So we have three different types: slow oxidative fibers, fast oxidative fibers, and fast glycolytic fibers. And as you can see in this picture, they actually look different under the microscope, in part due to differing levels of myoglobin. These fast glycolytic fibers don't need oxygen so much, so they don't have a lot of myoglobin. These slow oxidative need a lot of oxygen because they're going to be doing aerobic respiration, so they're very dark. They have a lot of myoglobin. So these slow oxidative fibers are great for low intensity endurance activities. So when they need to be used all the time. So as we mentioned before, you are constantly using your muscles in order to maintain muscle tone, just in order to sit up properly in your seat. And so we're going to be using our slow oxidative fibers for that. Our fast oxidative fibers, these are good for medium intensive activities. Things that you are able to do for a while, but actually require a bit more effort. Things like walking or sprinting are going to use up our fast oxidative fibers. And then our fast glycolytic fibers are great for really short, powerful movements. So when we need to expend a lot of force really quickly, like when we're hitting a baseball, that's going to use our fast glycolytic fibers. Our muscles are going to contain a mixture of different fiber types so that our muscles can be used for different jobs. However, all of the fibers in a single motor unit are the same type. So different fiber types can be activated by different motor units depending on what needs to be done. In order for muscles to contract, they need ATP. Remember ATP, adenosine triphosphate. This is the universal energy currency of the cell. Whenever the cell needs to do work, ATP is going to supply the energy for the cell to do that work. And different types of work are necessary in order for a muscle to contract. One obvious thing for ATP is going to provide the energy for the cross-bridge cycling, where the ATP binds, that's going to allow it to detach, then it's going to hydrolyze the ATP into ADP and a phosphate, that's going to cock it, then it's able to grab onto the actin and pull it. And then we need to use up more ATP in order to repeat the cycle. We're also going to use ATP in order to pump calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum in order to end contraction. We also need to expend ATP in the sodium-potassium ATPase, or the sodium-potassium pump, in order to maintain our proper concentrations of sodium and potassium outside and inside of the cell. However, ATP is an unstable molecule. That's what allows it to carry so much energy. But that means that we can't keep large stores of ATP inside of the cell. We only have enough ATP inside of the cell to keep it running for about 4 to 6 seconds. After that point, we need a way of making more ATP or regenerating it relatively quickly. And we have 3 mechanisms by which we can regenerate ATP. One is direct phosphorylation. This is going to use a molecule called creatine phosphate to directly convert the ADP back into ATP by transferring a phosphate onto it. Then we have the anaerobic pathway, which is going to use glycolysis and lactic acid formation, and the aerobic pathway, which is going to use aerobic respiration in the mitochondria. All of these have their benefits and their drawbacks. So direct phosphorylation of ADP by creatine phosphate. So creatine phosphate, this is a molecule that our muscles carry a store of, and it has a spare phosphate that is high enough energy to be directly moved onto ADP. Remember, ADP is adenosine diphosphate. It has 2 phosphates. If we add an extra phosphate to it, it becomes adenosine triphosphate, adenosine with 3 phosphates, aka ATP. So we have an enzyme called creatine kinase that's able to directly pull a phosphate off of creatine phosphate and put it onto ADP in order to make creatine and ATP. However, our muscle fibers only have enough creatine phosphate to power it for about another 10 seconds, giving us about 15 total seconds of activity. Then we need to do either an anaerobic or aerobic pathway. The anaerobic pathway is going to generate ATP through glycolysis, and then it's going to continue that glycolysis without oxygen through lactic acid fermentation. So, glycolysis breaks down glucose into pyruvate, and in the process it produces 2 ATP. That's all the ATP the anaerobic pathway generates. It only makes 2. Because there's no oxygen, this pyruvic acid can't be used in the rest of cellular respiration. Instead, it's going to be converted into lactic acid in order to allow glycolysis to continue. This only makes 2 ATP, but it makes this ATP very quickly and without requiring oxygen. So we're going to need oxygen in order to do aerobic respiration. We get that oxygen from our blood flow. If we are using up oxygen too quickly in our muscles and we're not able to provide those muscles with enough oxygen, then we need to rely on these anaerobic pathways. So anaerobic pathways produce less ATP than aerobic pathways, but does it faster and without oxygen. Aerobic respiration, this is how we make most of our ATP when we're at rest and when we are doing light to moderate exercise. You've probably heard exercise described as aerobic or anaerobic exercise. When we are able to sufficiently supply all of our muscles with oxygen, then we're going to try to rely on aerobic respiration because it produces way more ATP per glucose. However, it is slower than the anaerobic pathway. In the aerobic respiration pathway, this is going to occur in the mitochondria, and it's going to break down the glucose down completely into CO2 and oxygen, and we're going to make approximately 32 ATP per glucose. This is going to be fueled in part using glucose produced from glycogen. So remember, glycogen is a glucose storage molecule. It's also called animal starch. It's a polysaccharide made up of a bunch of glucoses stuck together in this branching molecule that can be relatively quickly broken down into glucose. We can also use glucose from the blood supply, and then after that, once we've used that up, then free fatty acids can be used for energy. fatty acids can be converted into acetyl-CoA that can be dropped right into the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle in order to produce more ATP. So in the first 6 seconds or so, we are going to be using up our cell's store of ATP. After that point, we're out of ATP in the cell. We need to make more. We get about another 10 seconds worth, so a total of about 15 seconds, by directly converting ADP back into ATP using creatine phosphate. Then after that, we are going to use up the glycogen stored in the muscles by breaking it down into glucose, which then gets oxidized in order to create ATP. So if we have a short-term high-intensity exercise, we're going to generate ATP through the anaerobic pathway. If we have a prolonged duration aerobic exercise, then we're going to use our blood glucose and our free fatty acids in order to break down those fuels in the aerobic pathway in order to continue to make ATP. Muscle fatigue is the point at which our muscles are unable to contract anymore. If you've spent some time exercising, you probably recognize that face as muscle fatigue, that time when you try to do one too many push-ups and all of a sudden your muscles start working and you just collapse. So what causes this muscle fatigue? It's commonly said that it's due to the buildup of lactic acid inside of the muscles. It's not actually thought to be that anymore. Lactic acid does build up when muscles are used through lactic acid fermentation, but that lactic acid is actually used by the body in a variety of ways that seem to be actually beneficial and doesn't seem to contribute to muscle fatigue. Muscle fatigue actually seems to be caused by ionic imbalances. So when our levels of potassium, sodium, and calcium get out of whack, and so our muscle can no longer properly send signals. When we get too much inorganic phosphate from the breakdown of creatine phosphate and ATP, that inorganic phosphate can interfere with the release of calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum and overall decrease in ATP levels, which correspond with an increase of intracellular magnesium. And magnesium tends to interact with voltage-gated proteins, so these can interfere with the voltage-sensitive T-tubule proteins and again interfere with the release of calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Also, once our muscles have depleted their store of glycogen, then our muscles are going to rely on glucose from our blood, and if we can't supply enough glucose quickly enough, then we're not going to be able to generate the ATP necessary to keep our muscles working. If you've done some exercise, you're probably also familiar with this particular position. So even once you are done exercising, if you've had a hard exercise, you're probably familiar with bending over, sticking your hands on your thighs, and then even though you're no longer running, you're still huffing and puffing. That is what's called excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. It used to be known as oxygen debt, but now we call it EPOC, excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. And that's what it looks like in the form of a graph. So essentially what happens is as we start to exercise, we essentially end up using our maximum amount of oxygen that we can get into our body, but then we end up with some processes that sort of get left over that we need to do after we exercise that continue to use up oxygen. So, for example, the oxygen reserves in our muscles. Our muscles have that protein called myoglobin, which actually ends up as an oxygen reserve. After exercise, that oxygen can get depleted and we need to replace it. That requires more than our normal amount of oxygen. Converting lactic acid back into pyruvic acid requires oxygen. Converting glucose into glycogen requires oxygen. Replenishing our ATP and creatine phosphate requires oxygen. All of these steps require oxygen, so even after we're done exercising, we still have above normal oxygen requirements for a while afterwards. Again, that's excess post-exercise oxygen consumption.